For years, I had avoided family events on Meu Marido's side. Rafael's relatives, especially my mother-in-law Dona Cecilia, made it clear I didn't belong. They saw me as an outsider, someone beneath their status, someone who would never be one of them. I still remember the first time I went to Sunday lunch at their house in Ipanema, how Dona Cecilia looked me up and down, noting my simple dress from a department store, while she wore pearls to cook feijoada. "And what does your father do again, Clara?" she had asked, knowing full well my father was a taxi driver and my mother cleaned houses in Copacabana. Rafael had met me at the university where I worked in the administration office while studying. Business at night. His family never let me forget I wasn't from their social circle. Over the 5 years of our marriage, I'd made excuses to miss birthdays, holidays, and anniversary celebrations. Rafael would go alone, returning with forced smiles and vague responses when I asked how it went. I knew they spoke about me, the poor girl who trapped their golden boy. What they didn't know was that while Rafael worked at his father's investment firm, I'd been saving, planning, working towards something they couldn't imagine. So when the invitation arrived, hand-delivered by their driver Paulo to our apartment, in Flamengo, I was suspicious. The paper was thick, the gold lettering elegant, but what struck me most was that it was signed by Dona Cecilia herself. "Querida Clara," it read, though she had never once called me dear to my face. "Your presence is requested at a special family luncheon." The location was Perola do Mar, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Rio, where celebrities and politicians dined overlooking Guanabara Bay. I stood on our small balcony, watching kids play football in the street below, the invitation trembling slightly in my hand. Why now? What had changed? Rafael hadn't mentioned any special occasion. "You should go," said Maria, my best friend since childhood, when I called her that evening. "Show them the Clara I know, smart, successful, strong. They'll just find new ways to humiliate me," I said, remembering how at our wedding, Dona Cecilia had loudly wondered if my family's neighborhood was safe enough for the guests to park their cars. "So what if they do? You're not the same woman they pushed around before." She was right, I wasn't. In the past 2 years, while Rafael's family thought I was running a cute little catering business, as his sister Luisa once called it, I had actually built a restaurant consulting company. I'd helped turn around 3 failing establishments and had recently made my first major investment. None of them knew, not even Rafael. I wanted to prove myself first, to stand on my own before revealing what I'd accomplished. I accepted the invitation, but didn't tell Rafael. His business trip to São Paulo meant he would arrive at the restaurant separately. I wanted to face them myself first. The night before, I laid out my outfit, a simple but perfectly tailored navy dress I'd bought in New York on my last business trip, and the single piece of expensive jewelry I owned, a pair of small diamond earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. The morning of the lunch, I took extra care with my appearance. I arranged my dark hair in a sleek updo and applied minimal makeup, aiming for elegance rather than flash. In the taxi ride to Leblon, I rehearsed responses to potential barbs about my career, my background, my clothes, anything they might use to make me feel small. The restaurant's exterior was understated luxury, a colonial-style building painted crisp white with blue trim overlooking the ocean. A doorman in an immaculate uniform greeted me with "Bom dia, señora," and directed me inside. The interior shimmered with sophistication. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, their light dancing off white tablecloths and polished silverware. The staff moved with graceful precision, their black and white uniforms crisp and professional. My heart pounded as the maitre d' led me toward a long table near the windows. Almost all of Rafael's family was already there. His parents, his sister Luisa with her husband João, his 2 aunts with their husbands, and several cousins. Their expressions ranged from surprise to discomfort at my arrival. Clearly, they hadn't expected me to accept the invitation. Donna Cecilia sat at the head of the table in a cream-colored designer suit, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, multiple gold bracelets jingling as she gestured. She glanced at me with a forced smile that never reached her eyes. "Clara," she said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to appear polite to an outsider. "How unexpected. We thought you might be too busy with your little project to join us." I took a deep breath, feeling the sea breeze from the partially opened windows, and returned her smile with one of my own. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, taking the empty seat that had clearly not been meant for me, judging by the lack of a place setting. Family is important, isn't it? A waiter quickly appeared with an extra set of silverware and a water glass. As he arranged them before me, I caught his eye briefly. Something in his expression seemed odd, a fleeting look of recognition, perhaps, but he quickly composed his features and moved away. I smoothed my napkin across my lap and looked around the table, determined to hold my head high for whatever came next. As I took my seat, the atmosphere grew colder than the restaurant's overzealous air conditioning. Conversations continued around me, but I wasn't included. Raphael's cousin Marcella, who had once been almost friendly at a Christmas gathering years ago, now seemed fascinated by her menu. His uncle Eduardo pretended not to see me when I caught his eye. I could feel the whispers, the subtle glances, the judgmental smirks passing between them like a secret language I wasn't meant to understand. Luisa, Raphael's sister, didn't even acknowledge my presence, though we were seated just 3 chairs apart. She made a show of talking across the empty space as if I were invisible, laughing too loudly with her husband about their recent vacation to Paris. "The French simply adore Brazilians with the right connections," she announced to the table. The manager at Le Cinq personally escorted us to our table when he heard Papa's name. I sipped my water slowly, anchoring myself in calmness, watching condensation form on the crystal glass. The restaurant buzzed with activity around us. Waiters gliding between tables, the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the murmur of conversations from other diners enjoying their Sunday lunch with genuine pleasure. Through the large windows, I could see fishing boats dotting the horizon, their white sails catching the midday sun. I felt a vibration from my purse and discreetly checked my phone. A message from Raphael. "Running late. Traffic from airport terrible. Be there soon." I put my phone away without responding. Part of me was relieved he wasn't here yet. Another part wished for his buffer between me and his family. "So, Clara," Donna Cecilia finally addressed me directly, her voice laced with saccharine politeness. "How is your little side business going? The catering, isn't it? Or was it cupcakes?" The table quieted, all eyes turning to me. This was typical. She would ask something she knew was incorrect, diminishing my work while appearing interested. "It's restaurant consulting, actually," I answered, keeping my voice even. "Business is good. Thank you for asking." "How quaint," she replied. "I suppose there's always a market for affordable dining options." Her emphasis on affordable made it clear what she thought of my professional level. I smiled and took another sip of water, knowing that anything more would invite ridicule. She had mastered the art of setting traps in conversation, asking questions not to hear answers, but to create openings for belittlement. She then launched into a monologue about social status, wealth, and knowing one's place, all while her eyes subtly targeted me. "Some people understand their position in society and work within it," she mused, swirling her white wine. "Others overreach and find themselves uncomfortable." I thought of my mother, who had raised me alone after my father died, working 2 jobs to keep me in school. She'd taught me to remain dignified in the face of disrespect. "Never let them see you bleed, Fila," she'd say. "The moment you show pain is the moment they win." So I observed quietly as they bragged about their travels, designer clothes, and recent investments, none of which seemed to bring them true joy. Luisa complained about her housekeeper mixing up her silk blouses with her cotton ones. Eduardo's wife, Teresa, lamented the difficulty of finding reliable staff for their summer home in Buzios. Roberto, Rafael's father, grumbled about the new tax regulations affecting their offshore accounts. These people had everything I had once thought important, yet they seemed perpetually dissatisfied, constantly looking over their shoulders at what others possessed. A memory surfaced. Rafael and me on our first date, eating pão de queijo from a street vendor in Lapa, laughing as cheese stretched between our mouths like spider webs. He had seemed so different from his family then, so uninterested in status. When had things changed? Or had I simply not wanted to see the truth? Mama tells us you've declined so many family invitations, Luisa said suddenly, her voice cutting through my thoughts. One might think you don't value family connections. Before I could respond, Eduardo's son Pedro jumped in. Or perhaps Clara simply feels out of place among us. His smirk made it clear this wasn't a question but a statement. I felt a flush creeping up my neck, but kept my expression neutral. I've been quite busy building my business, I replied. But I'm here today, aren't I? Yes, quite the surprise, muttered Teresa, just loud enough for me to hear. Speaking of surprises, Dona Cecilia interjected. Did you all hear about the Mendez family? Their son married that girl from Rosina. A dentist, I believe. Can you imagine? They had to host the wedding reception at a churrascaria. The table erupted in polite laughter, the implication clear. The Mendez family had married beneath their station, just as Rafael had done with me. I remembered my last conversation with Maria before coming here. Why do you even care what these people think? She had asked. I don't, I'd insisted. Then, why are you going? I hadn't answered her directly. The truth was complicated. I wasn't there to win their approval. I was there for something more important, something I hadn't fully admitted even to myself. The waiter arrived with menus, and I could see him trying not to smirk as he handed them out. Something was coming. I could feel it. The covers were embossed leather, heavy in my hands, with gold lettering announcing Perola do Mar across the front. The chef has prepared several specials for today, the waiter announced, his eyes briefly meeting mine with that same strange recognition. Particularly for this special gathering. As I opened my menu, I noticed Dona Cecilia, watching me intently. The anticipation in her eyes made my stomach tighten with apprehension. This invitation hadn't been about reconciliation. It had been about something else entirely. I glanced around the table, suddenly aware that everyone was staring at me with varying degrees of curiosity and malice. Even the usually disinterested Roberto had lowered his phone to watch. They were waiting for something. The atmosphere shifted from cold to predatory, and I realized I had walked into a carefully laid trap. But what I didn't know yet was that I wasn't the only one who had been planning in secret. Then, it happened. As we waited for the first course, a waiter arrived with a bottle of champagne, Dom Perignon, I noticed, and began filling glasses down the table. Dona Cecilia suddenly stood up, tapping her glass lightly for attention. The room hushed, other diners turning curiously toward our table. All eyes focused on her as she cleared her throat and looked directly at me. Her words came out sharp, echoing off the marble walls. You know, Clara, I've been thinking. You are far too poor to be part of this family gathering. Please leave immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. A woman at a nearby table gasped. The waiter pouring. Champagne froze mid-pour. I felt as if I'd been plunged into ice water, my body temperature dropping in an instant. My hands trembled slightly beneath the table, but I didn't move. I looked around. Some family members looked down at their plates, pretending not to hear. Others, like Luisa, smirked, as if amused by the drama. Roberto stared out the window, his face impassive. Only Pedro had the decency to look uncomfortable, shifting in his seat and adjusting his tie. My cheeks burned, but not from shame. rather from the anger boiling within. This was why they had invited me, not to reconcile, but to humiliate me publicly, to reinforce what they had always believed, that I didn't belong. In that moment, I thought about every slight I had endured over the years. The time Donna Cecilia had accidentally spilled red wine on my white dress at Raphael's birthday party. The Christmas when my gift to her, a handmade scarf I'd spent weeks knitting, had been forgotten under the tree. The countless times they had switched from Portuguese to English when I entered a room, knowing my English wasn't fluent. I thought about leaving, walking out with my head held high. It would be the dignified thing to do. But something kept me rooted to my chair. Perhaps it was the memory of my mother telling me, "Never run from bullies, Clara. They smell fear, like dogs." Donna Cecilia was still standing, her expression triumphant, waiting for me to slink away in humiliation. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. "Did you hear me?" she pressed when I didn't move. "This is a private family event, and frankly, you're not family. Raphael may have made his choice, but we don't have to pretend anymore. Not here, not today." I slowly reached for the menu in front of me. The leather was cool against my fingertips as I turned it around for everyone to see. On the cover, embossed in gold foil beneath the restaurant name, was my full name, Clara Mendez Santos. The room went still. Donna Cecilia's expression faltered, confusion flickering across her face. A few murmurs rippled through the table. Luisa leaned forward, squinting at the menu, then grabbed her own to check. Her eyes widened. "What is this?" Donna Cecilia demanded, her voice no longer quite so certain. "Some kind of joke?" I stood up calmly, my legs steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I placed both hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. The weight of dozens of eyes, family members, restaurant staff, other diners, pressed against me. But for once I didn't feel diminished by their attention. "No joke, Donna Cecilia," I replied, my voice steady as I spoke the words I had rehearsed in my heart for weeks. "Just business." The head waiter approached, standing respectfully at my side. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Donna Clara?" he asked, using the honorific that Cecilia had always denied me. "Everything is perfect, Antonio," I answered, not taking my eyes off my mother-in-law's increasingly pale face. "Perhaps you could explain to our guests the recent changes in ownership." Antonio nodded, addressing the table with professional courtesy. "For those who haven't visited us in the past 3 months, Perola do Mar is now owned by Donna Clara's company, Novo Horizonte Restaurantes. She has personally overseen our recent renovation and menu redesign." Teresa choked on her champagne. Eduardo's hand froze halfway to his bread basket. Roberto finally looked away from the window, his expression unreadable but his attention fully engaged. "This is absurd," Luisa sputtered. "You can't possibly own one of the most prestigious restaurants in Rio," I finished for her. "The same restaurant where your family has celebrated every major occasion for the past 20 years? The same restaurant where you held your engagement party, where Pedro had his graduation dinner, where Roberto closes all his important business deals." I paused, watching realization dawn across their faces. "Yes, I do." Donna Cecilia remained standing, but she seemed smaller somehow, her composure cracking like fine porcelain. "How?" she whispered. The question wasn't just about how I had acquired the restaurant. It was about how I, the poor girl from Copacabana whose parents had worked service jobs, could have possibly ascended to her level. How I could have gained the upper hand. "Hard work," I answered simply. "Something your family might not recognize." I saw anger flash in her eyes, briefly overriding the shock. "Raphael put you up to this," she accused. "He gave you the money." I laughed, a genuine laugh that felt like releasing a weight I'd carried for years. "Raphael doesn't know. This is my accomplishment, my investment, my risk. I gestured around the restaurant. My success. As if summoned by his name, Raphael appeared at the entrance of the dining room, scanning the tables until he spotted us. He looked handsome in his travel-rumpled suit, his expression brightening when he saw me. He hadn't been part of the setup. I could see it in his face as he approached, confused by the strange tableau before him, his mother standing, his family in various states of shock, and me, standing tall at the head of the table opposite her. "What did I miss?" he asked, coming to stand beside me, his hand automatically finding the small of my back. "Perfect timing," I said softly, kissing his cheek. "I was just about to explain to your family that they've chosen the perfect venue for today's lunch." Understanding dawned in his eyes as he glanced down at the menu still in my hand, my name clearly visible. His eyebrows shot up, and then, to my eternal gratitude, a slow smile spread across his face. "You did it," he murmured, pride evident in his voice. "You actually did it." I nodded, relief washing through me. I had kept my business ventures separate from our marriage, unsure how he would react to my ambition. His support now was everything. I turned back to Donna Cecilia, who had finally sunk back into her chair, her face a complex mask of emotions. Humiliation, anger, and perhaps, buried deep beneath layers of pride, a reluctant flicker of respect. "Now," I said, addressing the entire table but keeping my eyes on her. "Shall we begin our lunch? The chef has prepared something special today." With the room now silent, I turned to the entire table and said with quiet command, "Welcome to my restaurant." The moment the words left my lips, the entire dynamic shifted. My name on the menu was no accident. I had bought Perola do Mar 3 months ago, under my company Novo Horizonte Restaurants, and had invested every ounce of my savings and experience into transforming it into one of the finest dining establishments in the city. Eyes widened, faces turned pale. Donna Cecilia looked like the ground had opened beneath her. I saw disbelief, followed by panic, ripple through the faces of those who had just spent the last hour ridiculing me. They now realized that the woman they considered beneath them was the owner of the very place they had chosen to flaunt their status in. "This is impossible," Louisa whispered, her perfectly manicured nails scratching at the embossed lettering of my name, as if she could erase it through sheer will. "You couldn't afford—" "I've been building my business for 5 years," I explained calmly, sitting back down and motioning for Raphael to join me. My first client was a small boteco in Lapa that was struggling. I redesigned their menu, trained their staff, and restructured their finances. Within 6 months, they had lines down the block. My second client was a failing padaria in Ipanema. Now they supply bread to half the restaurants in the neighborhood. Raphael squeezed my hand under the table. He knew about my consulting work but had no idea about the restaurant. I had kept it separate, using my maiden name in business dealings to avoid any appearance of leveraging his family's connections. "You never told me," he said softly. "I wanted to do this on my own," I replied, "to prove I could." Antonio appeared, with a tray of appetizers, delicate pastéis filled with bacalhau, tiny coccinhas with truffle oil, and miniature empadinhas topped with fresh palm hearts. "The chef's compliments," he said, setting them in the center of the table. No one moved to take any. They were too stunned, too caught between their usual entitlement and their new uncomfortable position as guests in my establishment. "Please, eat," I encouraged, taking one of the pastéis. Chef Paulo trained in Portugal before joining us. His seafood is extraordinary. Slowly, hesitantly, hands began to reach toward the food. The ice had cracked, but the atmosphere remained tense. I turned to Donna Cecilia, who still hadn't spoken since her failed attempt to humiliate me. "This lunch was arranged with full knowledge of who I am," I explained, keeping my voice level. "When your assistant called to make the reservation 2 weeks ago, my staff recognized your name. They told me you specifically requested the best table for an important family event. I arranged this lunch to celebrate Roberto's business merger, she finally said, her voice thin. I had no idea this place had changed hands. That's not entirely accurate, Antonio interjected smoothly. When you called, Senora, you were informed of the new ownership. You specifically asked if Dona Clara would be present that day, and you were told she would be overseeing lunch service. I saw Raphael's eyebrows rise. He turned to his mother, waiting for her explanation. She had none to give. So this was a test, I continued. Not of me, but of you all. I wanted to see if anything had changed, if there was any possibility of genuine family connection. I looked around the table. But sadly, nothing has changed. You arrived ready to put me in my place, not knowing that place had shifted. You set us up, Eduardo accused, setting down his fork with a clatter. You humiliated us deliberately. No, Raphael countered before I could respond. You humiliated yourselves. His voice carried an edge I'd rarely heard. You came here planning to belittle my wife and instead discovered she's more successful than any of you realized. The shock on their faces at Raphael's defense of me almost made me laugh. They had always assumed he tolerated my presence, that our marriage was a youthful mistake he was too proud to correct. They never understood that we had built something genuine together, a partnership based on respect. I didn't buy this restaurant to trap you or trick you, I clarified, softening my tone. I bought it because it was a sound business decision. The previous owner was retiring, the location is perfect, and I saw potential to update the menu while keeping the traditional dishes that made this place famous. The fact that it happens to be your favorite restaurant is, let's call it an unexpected bonus. Pedro, who had remained quiet throughout, suddenly chuckled. You have to admit, Mama, he said to his mother Teresa, it's pretty brilliant. A waiter arrived with our first course, a delicate watercress soup with Brazilian sea scallops. The familiar routine of dining seemed to provide everyone a moment to recompose themselves. Wine was poured, bread was passed, and for a few minutes, the only sounds were the clink of spoons against porcelain and the murmur of conversations from other tables. I watched as they tasted the food I had helped create. Despite everything, I felt a surge of pride seeing their expressions of reluctant pleasure. The chef and I had worked for weeks perfecting the menu, blending traditional Brazilian flavors with modern techniques. This is quite good, Roberto admitted, breaking the silence. It was perhaps the first direct compliment he had ever given. Me, however grudgingly. Thank you, I replied simply. So all this time, Luisa said, gesturing vaguely with her spoon, when we thought you were just, what did you call it, Mama? Playing at business? I was building something, I finished for her. Something of my own. Only now, I wasn't the same woman they once dismissed. I was the host, the owner, and for the first time, I saw something, like respect in their eyes. Not from all of them. Donna Cecilia's gaze still held resentment, and Eduardo looked like he'd swallowed something sour. But from some, it was a start. To new beginnings, Raphael proposed, raising his wine glass. After a moment's hesitation, the others followed suit. As I clinked my glass against theirs, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. Not because I had won their approval, that had never been the point, but because I had finally stopped seeking it. I had built my own table instead of begging for a seat at theirs. The rest of the meal progressed with an uneasy truce. Conversation remained stilted, but the outright hostility had subsided, replaced by a wary curiosity. They asked questions about the restaurant, about my other business ventures, questions they had never bothered to ask before. I answered honestly, but briefly, no longer feeling the need to prove myself through words. My proof was all around us, in the elegant decor I had chosen, in the impeccable service I had trained, in the exquisite food I had helped create, in the gold-embossed menus that bore my name. As the main course, a perfectly seared robalo with cassava puree and passion fruit reduction was cleared away. I caught Antonio's eye and nodded slightly. He returned moments later with a waiter carrying a champagne bucket. "Compliments of the house," he announced, presenting a bottle of Dom Perignon. "My gift, as the owner." I thanked the staff graciously as flutes were distributed and filled with the effervescent liquid. I turned to my family-in-law, who now struggled to compose themselves. The atmosphere had shifted throughout the meal, but I could still feel their discomfort, their uncertainty about how to treat me now that the power balance had changed so dramatically. "I'd like to propose a toast," I said, raising my glass. "To family, both the ones we're born with and the ones we create." I thought briefly of my mother and how proud she would be of this moment. She had taught me to stand tall, to work hard, and to never apologize for my ambitions. Rafael, who had arrived late due to his business meeting in São Paulo, sat beside me, his eyes filled with a mix of shock and pride. Throughout the meal, he kept glancing at me as if seeing me for the first time. Perhaps he was. I had kept my business ventures separate from our home life, determined to succeed or fail on my own merits. "Clara," he whispered as the others clinked glasses. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Would you have told your family?" I asked softly. His silence was answer enough. He would have meant well, would have wanted to protect me from their judgment, their dismissal of my efforts as a hobby rather than a serious business. But in doing so, he would have undermined exactly what I was trying to prove, that I could stand on my own. "I've been looking for the right moment," I explained. I wanted to be certain of success before sharing it. "And now?" I smiled. "Now seems perfect." Across the table, Donna Cecilia was watching our exchange with narrowed eyes. I could practically see the calculations happening behind her gaze. The reassessment of my value to the family, now that I had shown myself to be not just Raphael's poor wife, but a successful businesswoman in my own right. "So, Clara," she said, her voice honeyed in a way I'd never heard her speak to me before. "Perhaps now you'll be joining us more often for family events, now that you're—" She gestured vaguely, unable to quite bring herself to acknowledge my success directly. I studied her face, the perfect makeup, the expensive highlights in her silver hair, the tightness around her mouth that spoke of recent cosmetic procedures. She was beautiful in a polished, manufactured way, but there was no joy in her beauty. For years, I had allowed this woman to make me feel small, insignificant, unworthy of her son. No more. "Donna Cecilia," I addressed her formally, setting down my champagne. "I want to be clear about something. I didn't build this business to impress your family or to gain your acceptance. I built it because I believed in myself, even when you didn't." The table fell silent again. Even the neighboring diners seemed to sense the tension and lowered their voices. "Respect isn't defined by wealth, titles, or bloodlines," I continued, my voice steady. "It's earned through integrity, hard work, and treating others with dignity, something I haven't always experienced in this family." Roberto shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Luisa examined her manicure with sudden fascination. Pedro surprisingly met my gaze directly, a flicker of what might have been respect in his eyes. "That said," I continued, "you're welcome to enjoy your meal here today, or to leave if you find you can't accept me as I am, not just as Raphael's wife, but as a person in my own right." Donna Cecilia's face flushed. I had called her bluff, exposed the hollowness of her sudden interest in including me, now that I had proven financially successful. For a moment, I thought she might stand up and walk out, taking the rest of the family with her. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly and took a deliberate sip of champagne. "The food is excellent," she said stiffly. "It would be a waste not to finish what we've started." One by one, they lowered their eyes. No one left. The power they once held over me had dissolved, replaced by an uncertain new reality they were still struggling to navigate. I excused myself, needing a moment alone to process the emotions swirling through me. "Please enjoy your dessert," I said, standing. "The passion fruit mousse is particularly good. Raphael, would you mind staying with your family? I'll just be a moment." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. As I walked away from the table, I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd set down a heavy burden I'd been carrying for years. The constant need for validation, the endless attempts to prove myself worthy of their acceptance. All gone now, replaced by something far more valuable: self-respect. I walked through my restaurant, smiling at the staff, pausing to adjust a flower arrangement to compliment a waiter on his attentive service. This was mine. The polished floors, the crisp white tablecloths, the hum of satisfied conversation from well-fed guests. I had built this with my own determination, my own intelligence, my own vision. I didn't need their validation. I had validated myself. In the kitchen, Chef Paulo was orchestrating the plating of desserts with precise movements. "Dona Clara?" He greeted me with a brief nod, never taking his eyes off the delicate chocolate garnish he was placing. "Everything is going well?" "Perfectly," I assured him. "The meal is magnificent." He allowed himself a small smile. When I had hired him away from a competitor, he had been skeptical of my vision for Perla do Mar, maintaining its reputation for elegance while updating its somewhat stagnant menu. Now, 3 months in, our reservations were booked solid for weeks in advance. "Table 7 has requested to speak with you," he informed me. "The older gentleman is most complimentary about the pêche." Table 7 was the Minister of Tourism and his wife, regular customers who had initially been wary of the change in ownership. I made a mental note to stop by their table on my way back. I stepped outside onto the small private terrace overlooking the beach. The afternoon sun danced on the waves, and a cool breeze carried the salt scent of the ocean. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension of the confrontation begin to dissipate. My phone buzzed with a message from Maria. "How's it going? Do you need me to stage an emergency rescue call?" I smiled and typed back, "No need. Everything is under control." And it was. For the first time in my relationship with Raphael's family, I was the one in control. Not in a vengeful way, but in the simple, powerful way that comes from knowing your own worth. When I returned to the table, dessert had been served. Raphael looked up with concern, but I reassured him with a smile. I slid back into my seat and took a bite of the passion fruit mousse, savoring the perfect balance of sweet and tart. "This is divine," Teresa admitted reluctantly. "Thank you," I replied. "The chef uses my mother's recipe with a few modifications." The meal concluded with coffee and petit fours. As they prepared to leave, each family member approached me differently than they had greeted me hours before. Roberto shook my hand, firmly, businessman to businesswoman. Luisa gave me a stiff, but not entirely insincere embrace. Pedro surprisingly asked for my business card. Donna Cecilia was last. She stood before me, her composure regained, but something new in her eyes. Not quite respect, perhaps, but recognition. "Your restaurant is impressive," she conceded, the words clearly difficult for her. "Perhaps we could discuss it further at our next family gathering." It was as close to an olive branch as I was likely to get. I accepted it with a gracious nod, but I made no promises about attending. The choice was now mine to make. That afternoon became the turning point in my life. As I watched Raphael's family file out of the restaurant, their BMW and Mercedes gleaming in the afternoon sun as the valets brought them around, I felt a profound shift within myself. I was no longer just someone's wife or daughter-in-law. I was a businesswoman, a leader, and most importantly, someone who no longer tolerated disrespect. Raphael stayed behind, declining his father's offer of a ride back to their office. "I think my wife and I have some catching up to do," he said, his voice warm with something like rediscovered admiration. When we were finally alone at the table, the lunch service winding down around us, he took both my hands in his. "Clara, what you've done is incredible. But why keep it secret from me?" I looked out at the ocean for a moment, gathering my thoughts. When we met, I was still studying, still figuring out who I wanted to be. Your family made it clear I wasn't who they wanted for you. I squeezed his hands. I think part of me was afraid that if I failed, it would prove them right. And if you succeeded? Then I wanted it to be completely mine. I smiled. No one could say you helped me, or that I used your family's connections. He nodded slowly. I understand. But from now on, no more secrets? Partners in everything? Partners. I agreed. That evening, as we walked along Ipanema Beach, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, I told Rafael everything. How I had saved every centavo from my consulting business. How I had secured a small business loan with my mother's apartment as collateral. How I had negotiated the purchase of Perola de Mar when the previous owner decided to retire to Portugal. The risk was enormous, I admitted. If it had failed, I would have lost everything. But it didn't fail, he reminded me, pulling me close as we walked. Because you're brilliant at what you do. Word of what had happened at the restaurant spread quickly. Rio's social circles thrived on gossip, and the story of how the daughter of a taxi driver had purchased the elite's favorite restaurant and then witnessed her mother-in-law try to humiliate her there was too delicious not to share. Within days, reservations at Perola de Mar doubled, and I gained respect from people who had never even met me. You've become something of a folk hero. Maria laughed over caipirinhas at our favorite bar in Lapa the following weekend. A symbol of social mobility. I rolled my eyes, but secretly I was pleased. Not for the attention, but because my success might inspire other women from humble backgrounds to pursue their ambitions without shame. My mother, when I finally told her everything, cried, and then laughed, and then cried again. Your father would be so proud, she said, clutching my hands in her work-roughened ones. He always said you were meant for great things. I invited her to dine at the restaurant as my honored guest. The staff treated her like royalty, and Chef Paulo prepared a special menu incorporating dishes from her recipes. The same food she had once sold from a small stall in Copacabana to support us after my father died. Seeing her there, in her best dress, being served by waiters in formal attire, healed something in both of us. My relationship with Rafael grew stronger in the weeks that followed. He stood beside me as I rose higher, no longer trying to shield me from his family's cruelty, but proud of how I had overcome it. He became my biggest champion, encouraging me to expand my business, to consider purchasing other restaurants. You have the Midas touch, meu amor, he said one night as we reviewed the month's profits. Everything you touch turns to gold. Not everything changed immediately, of course. Donna Cecilia never apologized, but her silence whenever we met spoke volumes. She knew she could no longer humiliate me. Our interactions became civil, if not warm. At family gatherings, which I now attended on my own terms, she would acknowledge me with a nod and sometimes even ask after the restaurant. Roberto, surprisingly, became something of an ally. A businessman at heart, he respected success, regardless of its source. He began recommending Perola de Mar to his associates, and even approached me about catering his company's annual meeting. Your wife has quite the head for business, I overheard him telling Rafael at a family birthday celebration. She reminds me of myself at that age. Rafael had laughed. She's better than you were, he'd replied. She did it without a trust fund. I expanded Novo Horizonte Restaurantes, acquiring a struggling churrascaria in Barra da Tijuca and transforming it into a modern interpretation of the traditional Brazilian steakhouse. 6 months later, I opened a casual cafe in Santa Teresa, that specialized in regional Brazilian coffee and pastries. Each success built upon the last, creating a reputation that extended beyond Rio to São Paulo and eventually internationally. Food magazines featured my restaurants. Tourism guides recommended them as must-visit destinations. Through it all, I maintained the values my parents had instilled in me, treating my staff with respect, paying fair wages, creating opportunities for young people from backgrounds like mine to enter the industry. My head chef at the cafe was a young woman from my old neighborhood who had never had formal training but cooked with the passion and skill passed down through generations of her family. 1 year after the infamous lunch, I received another invitation from Dona Cecilia. This time, it was for a family celebration at her home in Ipanema. I considered declining but decided to attend, curious to see how things had evolved. When I arrived, something had shifted in the family dynamic. Luisa's husband asked my advice about a restaurant investment he was considering. Pedro introduced me to his new girlfriend with obvious respect. Even Dona Cecilia, though still reserved, made a point of telling a guest about my impressive business acumen. As I sipped champagne on their terrace overlooking the ocean, Rafael joined me, sliding an arm around my waist. "Happy?" he asked. I considered the question. Was I happy? Not because of their validation, that no longer mattered to me, but I was content with who I had become, with the life we were building together, with the knowledge that I had stayed true to myself despite every obstacle. Yes, I answered honestly. I am. Later that evening, as we prepared to leave, Dona Cecilia approached me in the foyer. "Clara," she said, her voice lower than usual, "I've been meaning to tell you. The changes you've made to Perla do Mar, they're quite good. The new menu items especially. It wasn't an apology, but coming from her, it was significant." I nodded, accepting the small olive branch for what it was. "Thank you. I value tradition, but sometimes change is necessary for growth." Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, that I wasn't just talking about the restaurant. I tell this story not for revenge, but for every woman who has been told she wasn't enough. For those who have been judged for their background, their accent, their family's status, or lack thereof. Sometimes life gives you a moment, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to yourself how far you've come. That lunch wasn't about family. It wasn't even about success. It was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity, my right to take up space in a world that had tried to make me small, and I did. Now, 3 years later, as I stand in the kitchen of my newest venture, a cooking school for underprivileged youth in my old neighborhood, I think about how far I've come. The students gather around, eager to learn, to create, to rise. I see in them the same hunger that drove me, the same determination to build something meaningful. The secret, I tell them as I demonstrate how to properly reduce a sauce, is patience, and never, ever letting anyone else dictate your worth. They nod, absorbing not just culinary skills but life lessons. And in their eyes, I see not the reflection of a woman who once trembled before her mother-in-law's judgment, but the woman I have become, strong, successful, and finally, completely herself.